Hello. Today's mini lecture is about a few specific people that you might have known about or that, if they weren't mentioned, should have been mentioned in our readings by Sylvia Frey and Eddie Glaude. The first person is John Marrant, who was born free in New York but moved to Charleston, South Carolina in the 1750s. Marrant became a preacher and was a leader in the movement to bring people who fought in the American Revolution back to Africa if they were born there, or to Africa because that was their imagined homeland, specifically to live in Sierra Leone, which was a colony created for people of African descent to go to a homeland when they had survived slavery. This is a sermon that John Marrant gave in Prince Hall's Masonic Lodge in Boston. And because it was in the 1770s, this sermon on brotherly love uses weird letters. So I think it is, yes, F things for S's. They didn't have S's then, I guess. But the sermon is on brotherly love, and I just wanted to show you a few cool things about this sermon. About of course, the golden rule to love your neighbor as yourself, and praying to Jesus for understanding, and that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Let love be without dissimulation. Abhor that which is evil, cleave to that which is good. So this call to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, as holy and acceptable to God, is an important reminder because, remember, this is a black man talking to a black audience, a mostly free black audience in the 1770s. He goes on to talk about Masonry, and of course, Prince Hall founded the African Masonic Lodge in Boston, which is something of a business and educational organization. And of course, black men who wanted to pursue the knowledge that the Masons originally organized to pursue couldn't join the white Masonic lodges. So they developed the black Masonic lodges. And I do actually know some black Masons to this day. So God is the architect of the universe who framed the heavens for beauty and delight, and then called the earth to appear out of darkness, saying, "Let there be light." And it was so. He made the earth, the moon, and the stars, made all of the creatures, and God blessed them. Then of course, man is the most excellent and accomplished piece of the visible creation. God said, "Let us make man." Seneca, the ancient Greek, says that man is not a work huddled over in haste and done without forethinking and consideration. Man is the greatest and most stupendous work of God. Man has not only a body in common with all inferior animals, but into his body was infused a soul, a far more noble nature, a rational principle to act according to the designs of his creation and to contemplate the works of God. So the language that Marrant uses here of man differing from the animals is an enlightenment language. The rational principle is connected to the ability to live freely and the knowledge of freedom, that most important divine principle, and to the ideas of equality that ground the American Revolution and all of its language. So man is a wonderful creature, not undeservedly a little world within himself. Whatever is found in the Creator is found in man. And then he kind of switches tone from his glorying in God and the greatness of God's workmanship to, "And is man such a noble creature and made to converse with his fellow men that are of his own order, to maintain mutual love in society and to serve God in comfort with each other?" Of course, love your neighbor as yourself, right? Then what can these God-provoking wretches think who despise their fellow men as though they were not of the same species with themselves, and would, if in their power, deprive them of the blessings and comforts of this life, which God in his bountiful goodness hath freely given to all his creatures to improve and enjoy. Surely such monsters never came out of the hand of God in such a forlorn condition. The fall of man. So what he's done here, if you think about the context and the history, is I think he has placed the fall of man in the creation of racism. Because who are these God-provoking wretches that don't treat other men like the same species as themselves? In the era when cotton was becoming king, in the era when this new nation formed and decided not to make slavery illegal. Whereas in England, they did make slavery illegal. So that is a little bit of John Marrant for you. And I would also like to look at Harriet Jacobs, who comes much later than John Marrant. She was born, I believe, around the early 1800s. And in 1861, she published her narrative. The narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, didn't get any attention until a woman named Jean Fagan Yellen went to great lengths to prove that Harriet Jacobs was a real person, because most readers just assumed that a white woman pretending to be a woman who had been enslaved wrote the narrative, and it pretty much was ignored for over 100 years. Now, when you look at the videos, you'll get the background on Harriet Jacobs, but to me, a really fascinating part of Harriet Jacobs' narrative that doesn't get the attention I think it deserves is that before she has her fall from grace and has that affair with her white neighbor, she falls in love. So she asks, why does a slave ever love? And then she describes her first love. There was in the neighborhood a young colored carpenter, a free-born man. We had been well acquainted in childhood and frequently met together afterwards. We became mutually attached, and he proposed to marry me. I loved him with all the ardor of a young girl's first love. But when I reflected that I was a slave and the laws gave no sanction to the marriage of such, my heart sank within me. So this is an important moment in the text, because although she has described her owner, Dr. Flint, as a low-down, dirty bastard, and the man who she later consents to have an affair with, who is a white man, turns out to be, a 30-year-old man who had an affair with a 15-year-old girl. In between that, she makes this ideal of manhood and this ideal of love in telling the story of the free-colored carpenter. And that he wanted to work to buy her, but she knew that Dr. Flint would never consent to sell her. And finally, she finds out that Dr. Flint finds out that she wants to marry this man, and he calls her into his office and says, I have half a mind to kill you on the spot, or his eyes seem to say that. He says to her very mockingly, so you want to be married? And she says, yes. And he says, I'll convince you I'm your master. He asks if she loves him. Pardon me? On the blanket or on the actual couch? Well, it's okay, don't worry about it. Sorry for the interruption. Then Dr. Flint refers to the free black man as a puppy, after having called him the N-word. And Jacobs talks back to him, to this man who has the right and possible, the potential to kill her. She says, if he's a puppy, I'm a puppy. It's right and honorable for us to love each other, and he would not love me if he did not believe that I was virtuous as well. And this is the first time that Dr. Flint attacks her and beats her, right here in the highlighted section. So you can read this yourself. It's pretty short, The Word document is 13 pages, but I'm only here on page 3 of this story of what happens. Dr. Flint sees her talking to her lover on the street, and he's watching her out the window. I mean, this would actually make a pretty good movie when you think about the way she sets up this scene. And she gets called immediately to his room again, and who knows what happens in that room. And he just kind of watches her carefully. So since she knows she can't marry the free colored carpenter, and since Dr. Flint says he will shoot him like a dog, that man has to leave town, and she has this affair with Mr. Sands, who is the white neighbor. Now, here I've highlighted a pretty shocking comment that Flint makes. Flint says, "If I had accepted his proposals, he, as a physician, could have saved me from exposure." Now think about what's happening here and read between the lines. She's pregnant. And he says, "I'm a doctor. I could get you out of this if you did what I asked you to do. Or if I had been the one to get you pregnant, I would have gotten you out of it." He's offering to give her an abortion, or saying that he would have aborted her child if he had impregnated her. Really despicable guy. She tells him, "I've sinned against God and myself, but not against you," and asserts that sense of agency and identity that Eddie Glaude talks about, that Christianity gave people who were enslaved. She does not think of herself as a slave or his property. She thinks of herself as a person who is the child of God. And she continues to fight with Dr. Flint here, and it's something of a drama. She eventually has 2 children with Mr. Sands, and then she tells the story immediately after her story of how she rebelled against Sands by having these 2 children, by telling the story of Nat Turner. In her story of Nat Turner, she makes fun of the white men who came around and performed a muster and terrorized all of the black people in the neighborhood, supposedly looking for evidence. Those patrol bands, who were the predecessors, the policers, or the police in the times of slavery, the predecessors to policing and the idea of neighborhood policing, were the patrollers and lynch mobs who kept slavery functional, shall we say. So I'm going to scroll a little bit through Nat Turner here. And certainly Nat Turner is someone that you can think about and write about, even though we haven't had time to look at him. Then we have her talking specifically about the church. And if you're thinking about writing about Eddie Glaude, this information about the church, the idea that Genovese said, and Glaude takes issue with, the idea that Christianity made slaves accept their position. Here we have an example of a sermon in which people who were enslaved were told by a white preacher that they had to obey their masters. Obey your master. If you disobey your earthly master, you have offended your heavenly master. And she says, "We went home highly amused at Brother Pike's gospel teaching." So she just makes fun of, and basically calls out the untruth of that message, which makes Eddie Glaude right and Genovese wrong, that slavery prevented the development of, that slavery or religion prevented the development of political consciousness, or a sense of being an active agent, a person with their own sense of power and identity. So I know I've been going for quite a long time here. I'm going to switch quickly to Blackboard.